African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. The Congo Crisis 1960–1963 Katanga Secession th. Congo got her independence from Belgium on 30 June 1960 with St. Joseph Kasavubu as the one President and Patrice Lumumba the one th. Prime Minister. A few days later, on 5 July 1960, the Force Publique mutinied. This encouraged Moise Tsham, the governor of Katanga from Congo and leader of Kanaka, to declare the secession of Katanga from th. Congo on 11 July 1960. The Katanga secession was therefore a separationist attempt by the Katanga province in eastern Congo under the leadership of Moise Tsham, expressing the desire to want to separate from Congo between 1960 and 1963. Role of Lumumba Patrice in the attainment of independence. He was born in 1925 into a small tribe of Betatella in Kasai province. He grew up in a Catholic family in Kisangani and have developed a remarkably sharp mind and curious characteristic. He worked as a post office clerk and later became a sales manager at a bakery in Kisangani. Therefore, he became a political activist and critic of the Belgian government. He adopted Pan-African sentiments and disagreed with other African nationalists like Kasavumba and Tsham, and believed in unfaism as the cause of regional nationalism. Lumumba's dream was to liberate Congo, set up a strong central government. Lumumba's role. He provided leadership for the struggle of independence. In Congo, using his charisma, organizational ability, he organized, mobilized the people and criticized the Belgian colonial policies. He also made them aware of the oppressive and exploitative nature of the Belgians. He blamed all the problems on the Belgians. Lumumba formed Movement National Congress in 1958. This party was formed in World War I and II as a medical movement for fighting for independence of Congo. Brazzaville in 1958, in which Lumumba had also inspired political movements. The Amino attracted a large number of Bangalo speakers of the Equatorial Province, also formed alliance with other minor political parties and therefore served as a national-wide support influence. Lumumba took part in the December 1958 All-Africans People's Congress up in Accra, Ghana on his return to Congo. In 1959, he addressed a rally in Leopoldville and appealed to the people's patriotism, and his message that independence was not a gift but a right sparked off popular uprising in the Leopoldville Kinshasa. Lumumba also utilized their oratory skills to criticize Belgian colonial policies in Congo. His speeches, which always targeted Belgian colonial policies, provoked massive not-ith. This was to put pressure on the Belgian colonialists to grant independence in the year that followed the Knots. Lumumba attended the Brussels World Trade Show in 1958. At the African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. He participated in various political negotiations that led to the granting of independence to Congo in 1960. He even led negotiations in Brussels while being detained in prisons with Belgians for the question of independence. Lumumba took part in pre-independent elections, and his MNC managed to win the pro-independence elections of 1960, while his party won 33/30 seats against other political parties like Ganakat and the Abako. He therefore became Prime Minister of Congo on th. 30 June 1960. Lumumba put on pressure the Belgians for constitutional changes. He also added to the economic and social reforms. He particularly criticized the Belgians' exploitative policies. For example, in 1935, the economic conditions in Congo were bad owing to poverty, underdevelopment, oppression, and falling prices of cities. Discontent was on there, especially among the urban elites, educated natives. He then mobilized the discontented masses against the Belgians to demand for the economic and independent measures. Other factors. They include the following. There was remarkable change in Belgian attitude in 1957. Their attitude changed and made them allow the Congolese to elect their own leaders in Leopoldville. Subsequently, Joseph Kasavubu was elected major stone of the communist towns like Kisangani. The role of Catholic Church. It defined the oppressed masses and acted as their watchdog during the period. In 1956, the Church openly advocated for political rights when it established a study group that issued a manifesto and proposed for independence. The spiritual influence of the Church kept it fine of Congolese. The role played by other political parties, for example Kanakat and Abako. These parties has been formed following the constitutional government of 1957. Apart from MNC formed by the Obakongo ethnic group was started by Joseph Kasavubu, which started to demand for immediate independence. Later in 1959, Moise Tsham united the Katangese Straits in another political party, the Kanakat. The activities of political parties th. drove Congo to her independence on 30 June 1960. The role of Charles de Gaulle. In August 1958, Charles de Gaulle, the President of France, visited Brazzaville to proclaim autonomy within the French colony for the 4 colonies acquired Federation of the French Equatorial Africa. This provoked unrest, as it meant the French side of DRC was on its road to independence. Political parties in the Congo then started to demand for their independence from Belgium. Subsequently, strikes and disorders broke out in January 19. These strikes were later suppressed, but they laid various negative effects on Belgian prisons and prestige. African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. The personal ambitions of Moise Tcham, the leader of Connecticut and governor of Katanga, had failed to secure himself a prominent position in the central government in Congo at the eve of the country's independence. Thus, in the frustrated dreams which were occupied with qualities that demonstrated the Polish style of political man-over, Moise Tcham attempted to establish the state of Katanga. The military mutiny of the Force Publique on 5 June 1960. The Force Publique mutined in protest of the Belgian commander Janssens, of who had declared his position refusing to Africanize the Force Publique. This encouraged Katanga under Moise Tcham to break away because there was no force the government could rely on to suppress the rebellion by Katanga. The influence of the Pakistan secession from India in 1947. This also influenced the emergence of micronationalism in Congo, as well as having a spillover effect Congo. In 1947, the British granted Pakistan independence by separating her from India. This influenced Moise to declare Katanga secession on 11 July 1960. The Katanga secession was encouraged by the economic potential of Katanga, which gave rise to a feeling of micronationalism. The province of Katanga was endowed with great economic potential like minerals, gold, copper, zinc, tin and aluminum. Katanga boasted a high-quality forest for timber and high fertile soils. The bulk of this wealth was in the hands of the Belgians. Therefore, Katanga thought she could stand on her own without the help of the army. Weakness of the UNO were the Belgians interfered with territorial integrity and sovereignty of Congo by deploying troops in support of Katanga. Lumumba reported this Belgian oppression to the UN Security Council, which took no action. The Britain and France did not want to frustrate Belgium because she was a member of NATO, as the Lumumba government was considered as pro-Soviet Union. The abrupt premature independence granted to Congo by the Belgian on 30 June 1960, which created a weak central government. The Congolese didn't have time to develop the kind of strong political structures that had attracted Africans from North Central, West and East Africa make similar transitions to independence without great difficulty. The civil service was still weak and the army still dominated by the Belgians. This was worsened by the independence constitution, which created provinces that were semi-autonomous. The absence of adequate preparation for independence weakened the new set and encouraged bids for secessionism. The aspect of Belgian conspiracy / the support of the Katanga secession. The Belgian added fuel to the Congo crisis by giving moral, financial and military aid. African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. The influence of the white Belgian settlers in Katanga. They directly gave assistance to Moise Tcham in the secessionist attempt. This was because it had granted their mineral rights and they had set up companies to mine and exploit in the general government under Kasavubu and Lumumba. Therefore, they gave support to the Katanga secession. The Brussels Constitution, which ushered Congo into independence in 1960, didn't clearly spell out whether Congo was a military or federal state. It therefore left some provinces within Katanga which were mainly autonomous, a mistake which Tcham capitalized on to separate the state of Katanga in 1960. The murder of Patrice Lumumba on 17 Jan 1960 won all Liam Azri and Mitchell. Tidy wrote that, when Lumumba was murdered, the Congo was redelivered politically on when the UN intervened 3 years earlier. The confusion enabled Katanga to strengthen in South Kasai secession. Lumumba's mysterious death left his country chaotic, divided, and more confused than ever before, which encouraged bids for secessionism. The influence of Cold War politics of the time. The involvement of superpowers in the affairs of Congo weakened the central government to the extent that Kasavubu the president and Lumumba the prime minister did not work together anymore. This encouraged Katanga secession and the Kasai centrifugal forces. The bombing of Port Matadi by the Belgians. The character and personality disadvantage of Patrice Lumumba, arrogant and compromising, considered his subject inferior and told the Belgians, "We are no longer your monkeys." In his speech, Weakness of the central government in Leopoldville-Kinshasa. The past regime led by Joseph Kasavubu and Patrice Lumumba's premier was weak and inefficient. Kasavubu was federalist and capitalist. Lumumba was a socialist and built in a strong central government unitarist. When Peace Publique mutinied and the Katanga rebellion broke out, the G took course of action. Lumumba insisted that the rebellion should be crushed militarily, while Kasavubu wanted a national conferences to address the issue. Subsequently, on 5 December 1960, President Kasavubu declared Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba dismissed in retaliation. Patrice Lumumba declared Kasavubu deposed. This confusion was exploited by Moise Tcham to parade his bid for secessionism. Regional imbalance. Reasons for the failure of Katanga secession. The role played troops who were invited to Congo by Patrice Lumumba, who invaded Katanga region from 1906 to 1962, ending the secession both on paper. African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. his own life when he died on a plane crash on an ill-fated visit to Congo during the crisis. The death of Patrice Lumumba on 17 Jan 1961, which has been blamed on Moise Tsham, lost national and international support. In spite of Lumumba's radical and maximized ideas, he was a respected Congolese nationalist at home and abroad. His death at the hands of Tsham disappointed the latter capitalist allies including Belgium, Britain and France. They condemned Tsham and cut off diplomatic ties with Katanga. The personality and character of Moise Tsham discredited him, plus his secessionist ideas. Though he had the right views, he lacked the political skills needed to achieve his aim. He was arrogant and autocratic in conduct. Massery and Mitchell Tidy wrote that what was wrong with Tsham and his political elite, his alliance with the Belgians and other elites alienated him from the Congolese who detested neocolonialism. The idea of secession also lacked widespread of local support from the Katanga secession themselves and rather depended on Belgian money, weapon and man. Katanga itself people were divided due to tribal differences. Those in favour of unitary government presented the idea of separation from theirs of the country besides cities, and Katanga used their influence to campaign the secessionist attempt. They even mobilized and sensitized the public against Isham, for example, Anton Geisinga. The flight of Moise Isham to exile in USA in 1963 made Katanga lose a political leader. This made the Katangese, who were unable to fight their enemy, to frustrate the secession further. Tsham was invited back from his imposed exile and named Prime Minister in the Kasavubu government in 1964, and Katanga was reinstated as part of Congo. The refusal of OAU to recognize the Katanga secession also led to the failure. The OAU instead supported the central government and condemned the secession as disrespect of the OAU member states and denounced Isham's self-styled government in Katanga. The fact that Katanga didn't receive OAU's blessing led to its failure in 1965. The assistance by the central government of Congo received from the Soviet Union. It gave the central government large amounts of ammunitions. These, together with lorries and other supplies, strengthened the Congolese Nationalist Army. By the end of August 1962, Kasai was occupied, which left Katanga isolated and only waiting for the defeat which came in January 1963. The role played by the Catholic Church in Congo. It added its voice in the condemnation of Tsham. It referred to him as murderer who had converted Katanga into a death yard. This was because he either failed or killed his enemies. The victims went ahead to curse Tsham and generation after him to hell. The fact that the Catholic Church had a lot of influence in the Congo, his voice worked against the Katangese secessionist attempt. African history, Seccesionist struggles in Africa. There was lack of dear political programs by Katanga TSH government in Katanga. Tsham's government in Katanga didn't preserve clear political program for the betterment of the people of Katanga. Instead, his secessionist attempt based itself on other narrow interests like religionism and tribalism. Besides, Tsham didn't do anything to improve on the government that had been practical by the Belgians in Katanga. Tsham's ambition was rather to secure himself a prominent position in the central government and not liberate the people of Katanga. The Congolese government also got military assistance from South Africa in spite of the absence of a negligible domestic military force. Lumumba, the Prime Minister, appealed to the international community for assistance. South Africa's apartheid regime responded to his appeal by sending military to the central government, which further strengthened the Congolese Nation Army against the secession. Reorganization of the Congolese National Army ANC. This helped to preserve the military balance of power in favor of the central government. Why? Government, the ANC had reconstructed itself. It was better equipped, Africanized into leadership. It was placed under the leadership of Colonel Joseph Mobutu, who served as the Army Chief of Staff. The army was expanded, equipped and strengthened, and got assistance from UNO. This strong manpower and equipment enabled the army to capture large pieces of land destined for Katanga. The withdrawal of Belgian support from Katanga made their defeat inevitable. It also helped to confirm the military weakness of Katanga, gradually unpopular to the Katangese in the rebellious provinces. The defeat of Katanga under Moise Tsham was therefore inevitable. By April 1964, the central government was able to undertake new constitutional measures. It divided the tribal regions into 21 provinces, which watered down the ethnic nationalism in Congo. Some held secret talks with Kasavubu, and Katanga was reconciled with the rest of Congo. Guiding question. 1. Account for the failure of Katanga's secession of 1963. 2. To what extent was Moise Tsham responsible for the outbreak of Katanga secession? Effects of the Katanga secession. It encouraged other secessionist movement in Africa. It weakened Congolese central government in Kinshasa by causing conflict between President Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba. It caused the invitation of the UNO troops into Congo by Patrice Lumumba to help in the process of silencing the process of Katanga secession. African history, Seccesionist struggles in Africa. It militarized the politics of Congo, thereby paving way for military rule in Congo when Colonel Mobutu captured power through a coup in 1964. Increase in economic destruction and social life, i.e. properly like infrastructure, was destroyed. Promoted neo-colonialism in Congo and worsened Cold War conflicts since Lumumba sought for external support from South Africa. Exposed the double standards of Venus since it failed to adequately stop the Congo crisis. It made Hisham to achieve his selfish ambition of becoming a political leader in the Kinshasa government of Kasavubu when he was appointed Prime Minister in 1964. It led to loss of lives of both Christians and Kansatans, especially in the province of Katanga, which in the view of the Catholic Church had been referred to as a death guard. The Biafran secession 1967-1970. The Biafran secession was masterminded by Lieutenant Colonel Odumwenguchukwu Meko Ojukwu. It represented a separationist attempt by Biafra region in eastern Nigeria wanting to break away from Nigeria between 1967 and 1970. On 30 May 1967, Ojukwu solemnly proclaimed the Republic of Biafra. Subsequently, on 6 July 1967, the Biafran War began when a federal military offensive was launched on Biafra by President Yakubu Gowon. The Igbo of Eastern region had decided to set up a separate state of Biafra, which lasted up to January 1970 when the secessionists were defeated. Causes of the Secession War. The British colonial policy of divide and rule policy in Nigeria. The British undermined the unity of the country through their divide and rule method of administration. Until the 1940s, the British separated the North from the South. They looked at their subject as Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba, Igbo, among other, and not as Nigeria. Besides, the British concentrated on Christians and in westernizing the South, making it difficult for the northern Muslims to coexist with southern Christians. The role played by the religious differences in Nigeria also caused the Biafran secession. The Hausa Fulani in the north were predominantly Muslims and had a strong adherence to Islam and the Sharia law since the 19 Jihad-based era. On African history, Seccesionist struggles in Africa. The economic potential of Biafra in eastern Nigeria also led to the secession spirit among the Biafrans. The region was quite endowed with abundant economic potential. For instance, it was proximated to the coast, which had fertile soil, abundant foodstuff, and production of palm oil. Most important was the discovering of petroleum and oil deposit in Biafra, which even attracted foreign companies. Thus, the desire to want to monopolize such natural and economic endowment for their own exclusive material prosperity compelled them to secessionist war from 1967 to 1970. The domination of the Nigerian politics by the Northerners also led to the secession. In the federal parliament, for instance, the North occupied more than half of the seat. Position in the government also favored the North. Thus, the unable Igbo tried to occupy a considerable portion of the civil service. They were not comfortable with exclusive power and privileges given to the Hausa and Fulani. Many of them criticized the Tafawa Balewa government as corrupt. This partly explains why they organized a coup in 1966 to overthrow Tafawa Balewa. The massacre and harassment of the Igbo by other tribes in the north and other parts of the country, especially during Gowon's presidency. This increased anger among the Igbo in the southeastern of Nigeria. By early September 1966, around 20,000 Igbo had been exterminated. Such genocide against the Igbo, masterminded by the Gowon administration, which was to later encourage bids for secessionism by the Igbo. The character and personality of Odumwengu Ojukwu also made the Biafra secessionist attempt inevitable. He was very uncompromising in character. For instance, in May 1961, a National Reconciliation Committee, which included Chief Obutary and Alowo, forbid attempts to discourage him from the secessions. Gowon accepted some of the committee's proposals, but Ojukwu refused to accept. Besides, he was not practical in his views. For instance, he wanted a federal government to consult with regional governments in all matters of the state before any decision could be made. When Gowon failed to meet his demands, he declared the Biafran secession. The death of General Iron is after 6 months of office. It was protested by the Igbo, hence leading to the 1967-70 Biafran secession in Nigeria. The North had controlled government from 1960-66, but the Igbo were given only 6 months in the government of Nigeria. It went back to Lieutenant Colonel Gowon, another northerner. This then encouraged a spirit of secessionism among the Igbo. External influence also aided Biafran War of Secession. A number of countries did involve themselves in the Nigerian affairs. This transformed the crisis from bad to worse. Rather than unifying the secessionist and the federal government, external government instead worked hard to worsen. The central government got support from USA and the Soviet Union, while Ojukwu got support from China, France. The failure of General Archer's intervention through Abuja Conference in 1967. In 1967, General Archer, the president of Ghana, tried to intervene in a bit about African history, Seccesionist struggles in Africa. Reasons for the failure of the Biafran succession. By 1970, Despite Biafra's attempt to succeed between 1970, by January 1970, the federal forces were able to defeat Ojukwu and his supporters owing to the following factors. Opposition to the Biafran secession by some Biafrans. This meant that the idea of secession by Biafrans lacked widespread and local support within the Biafran region. The minority groups were there, although having suffered from northern violence and misrule were less supportive about the concept of Biafra. Some of the Igbo even cooperated with the federal folks against Biafrans, and among them included Isak Akpalbi, a political science lecturer, and Nandi Izakiv, who opposed the idea of secession. The declaration of a feudal blockades on Biafra by Gowan's federal government. In order to defeat the Biafrans, Gowan's government decided to improve economic sanctions by cutting off Biafra from any contact with other parts of Nigeria and with the outside world. This step led to acute shortage of supplies, including weapons, among the Biafrans. Food shortages became common, and deaths as a result of malnutrition became a common sight among the Biafrans. Gradually their resistance was broken, forcing them to surrender by January 1970. The massive support that the federal government of Nigeria received from Britain and the Soviet Union. This must have weakened the Biafrans. Britain, Nigeria's former colonial master, wanted to maintain a considerable influence in Nigeria. OAU's refusal to recognize Biafra. Instead, the OAU threw its weight to support the federal government of Gowan, since the OAU stood for unity and Pan-Africanism. It therefore didn't support Biafra at Sabnash, and therefore engaged in a number of processes and efforts to decampaign the Biafran succession, leading to its failure by 1970. The heavy military bases suffered by the Biafrans from 1968 to 1970 also forced them to surrender. As the war progressed, most of the strategic towns and cities fell into the hands of the federal forces. These included towns like Nsukka, Owerri, Calabar, Inuka, Uli Airstrip, and later Port Harcourt. The heavier blow was the capturing of the Uli Airstrip, which cut off Biafra from its links with the outside world, making the defeat of the secession possible by 1970. Gowan's determination to defeat the Biafra secessionists and to maintain Nigeria into a 12-state structure then sought from Nasser of Egypt, who provided him air force planes and which Egyptian pilots were able to wreak havoc from the Biafrans. They indiscriminately splashed bombs on the Biafrans, leading them to surrender. The abdication of Ojukwu to Ivory Coast on 11th Jan 1970. This left the people of Biafra with no leaders. They therefore lost a sense of direction as they became demoralized. Then on 12th Jan, the Biafra forced surrender to the federal government of Nigeria. Lack of political programs by the Biafra also made its defeat inevitable by 1970. The Biafra secession led by Ojukwu lacked a substantial plan or manifesto that African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. The military weakness of Biafra also led to their defeat by 1970. For instance, by the end of the war, federal forces' number was 120,000. On the other hand, Biafran forces were few in number, as many of their experienced soldiers had been killed in July 1996 coup, while others were taken as captives and others deserted. Besides, the Biafran soldiers were ill-treated compared to federal forces. The resistance the federal government of Nigeria got from World War I and II veterans. These were men of enormous experience, and their support to federal army helped to boost the government side against the secessionists. In contrast, the Biafrans had a small army, trained officers mainly being killed in the July 1966 coup. This led to Biafrans' defeat by 1970. The effective military strategy employed by the Gowan administration in Nigeria. This involved placing the command of Nigerian Federal Army under experience like General Olusegun Obasanjo and General Mustafa Mild. They were able to engulf the Biafrans out of supply routes in the Biafra territory. They also used the strategy of heavy bombings. Through them, Biafra lost her stronghold like the NIP airships and her other towns like Owerri, Neka, and Enugu. Effects of Biafran secession. Negative effects. The war promoted neocolonialism in Nigeria's foreign power like Britain, France, and the Soviet Union and other countries began to influence the internal affairs of Nigeria. The war also strained the Nigerian economy by causing economic dislocation, i.e., oil revenues. The war created a refugee crisis, especially in neighboring countries like Cameroon and Ivory Coast, which presented a big burden to the host countries, to the OAU and NRC. The war also influenced tribalism in Nigeria, i.e., Igbo versus other tribes like Yoruba and Hausa. It led to the loss of lives, especially among the Biafran, but also among both civilians and combatant fighters. The Biafrans were defeated and Ojukwu fled out of the country to Ivory Coast. This made the Biafran fighters to surrender on 12 Jan 1970. The war created a refugee crisis, especially in neighboring countries like Cameroon, etc., which presented a big burden to the host countries and organizations like OAU and NRC. Positive effects. OAU reconciled Nigeria with states that had recognized Biafra, for example Ivory Coast. It led to the drawing up of a new constitution for Nigeria which enhanced social, political, and economic progress. The war reconciled the defeated Biafrans Igbos with the rest of Nigeria. African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. Gowan provided relief aid to the Biafrans, including reconstruction of war-ravaged areas. It made Biafran scientists to become innovative. They manufactured machines, transformed the civilian aircraft into fighting machines, and made shift refineries for fueling vehicles, among others. Reference question: examine the causes and effects of the Biafran War of Secession between 1967 and 1970. The Civil War in Chad 1965–1982. Chad, a former French colony who received/regained her independence in 1960 under its first president François Tombalbaye of the Progress Party of Chad (PPC). The composition of this party was predominantly of the non-Muslims and partially Christianized Southern era. In about a decade after independence, a rebellion broke out in the desert northern half of the country in 1965 and developed into a full-scale war involving the struggle for power and control of the central government between Nasser and Tabu. The main rebel movement was the Chad National Liberation Front Frolina. Causes of the Chad Civil War. Maladministration by the southern Serra civil servants in the north. This era were appointed by the President Tombalbaye to replace territorial chiefs in the north, and they became harsh, oppressive, and exploitative, something that was resented by the Tavu people in the north who demanded for fair treatment. Failure by Tombalbaye administration to listen to their demands provoked them to rebel, hence sparking off the civil war in Chad. The dictatorship of President Tombalbaye also led to the outbreak of the Chad Civil War. For instance, in 1962 he banned all opposition parties. All potential rival leaders and their followers were banned from the Progress Party of Chad (PPC). The underground position that followed was counted as widespread arrests of suspects. It rebuilt themselves in 1963 when brutality was used to suppress anti-government rituals of the trade unions and students in frontline Ujamina. Such reaction by the government was responded to in equal and the opposite reaction by the Tabu people, leading to a civil war. Religious discontent by northerners also worked in causing the civil war in Chad. The government depended on Christian Serras of the south ruling over the northern, who were mainly Muslims. The Tabu people were persecuted for their faith. For example, they were prohibited from wearing turbans and carrying knives. They also hated the fact that they were being ruled by Christian infidels, thus such religious dissatisfaction of Tabu made them pick up arms of Tombalbaye regime, leading to a civil war in Chad. The civil war was also as a result of unfair taxation system put by Tombalbaye regime. His first mistake was to employ his own tribesmen in the civil African history. Seccesionist struggles in Africa. The Tombalbaye's Chaditude policies/cultural revolutions also worked to fuel the civil war in Chad. In 1973, Tombalbaye launched the cultural revolutions in an attempt to create national unity through retraditionalization. Accordingly, Christian names were banned and many place names changed. Francois Tombalbaye became Ngada Tombalbaye. Fort Lamy became Njana. Christian and intellectual elite, including the dominant Serra, opposed this mistake proposed by Tombalbaye. They hated the tradition of Tondo initiation rite, which Tombalbaye had made mistakes. They also resented the religious persecution that followed. As all this was happening, Frolin opposition was strengthened by divisions in the southern leadership caused by Tombalbaye police of Chaditude, leading to a civil war in Chad. Failure by Tombalbaye and Gaucani administration in Chad to create a national army also led to a civil war in Chad. This left Chad with very many private armies with divided loyalty, thereby undermining the possibility of the united fort against the Frolinite rebels, which in turn fueled the civil war in Chad. Tombalbaye government also promoted regional imbalance. Most of the better social amenities like the good roads, hospitals, schools, accommodation were allocated in the south and north, was among especially the northern Tabu Muslims, who accused the Tabu Bailey regime of sidelining them in economic development, hence leading to the Chad Civil War. French colony legacy was also to blame for the break of civil war in Chad. French colonial masters didn't integrate the tribal and religious groups of Chad. Instead, the French favored the Christian Serra of the south in civil service and used them to dominate Tabu Muslims in the north. This promoted hatred and division of Chad, leading to civil of 1965–1882. Failure by Gauchan's government to create a national army also fueled the civil war in Chad. Gauchan had tried but failed to create a national army out of the private armies with 100 more factions that comprised his government of national unity (UNT). This gamble had failed as from Jan 2 June 1982. Habes. FAN troops advanced steadily through the central and northern districts within the country. This meant that Chad didn't have a patriotic army ever since independence that could be used to prevent the outbreak of the civil war in the country. External forces were also present in causing the civil war. For instance, Habers. FAN forces received supplies from Egypt and Sudan, while Gauchanese forces received aid from Libya troops and weaponry. France also gave the Chad leader Gauchani financial aid and arms supplies in order to alienate him from Gaddafi of Libya. Earlier on in 1968 and again in 1969–1972, France also assisted Tombalbaye by timely intervention against a rebellious Frolin, hence fueling the civil war in Chad. The Cold War politics were also to blame for causing the civil war in Chad. This was peddled by US and USSR. These powers turned Chad into a dumping African history seccesionist struggles in Africa. Malum met Gaddafi and Sub in the presence of Niger. Sani Kunch and the vice president of Sudan, for example, agreed on the ceasefire. Talks later continued between the Chad government as the Frolinet advanced. The weakness of the OAU can also be blamed for the outbreak of the Chad Civil War. Although the OAU peacekeeping force numbering 300 men had been integrated in Narvandek in 1981 mainly from Niger, Senegal and Zaire commanded by a Nigerian Major General Geoffrey Edgar, they failed to have Habe's FAN forces advancing the northern and central districts of Chad. Even steps taken by the OAU meeting in Nairobi in Feb 1982 were not effective enough. OAU members were also constrained by finances, besides they failed to agree on what peacekeeping mission should be. As a result, the force's mandate remained unclear and they withdrew, leading Habe's FAN forces into action, which resulted into the Th7 June overthrow of Gaukuns. Tom Balbit's government practiced nepotism and favoritism, created regional imbalance. The exclusion of Gaukuni from the government of national union also fueled a civil war in Chad. After being saved from possible coup by French forces, Malum remained president but appointed Hissène Habré as prime ministers in August 1978, and an attempt was made to appoint ministers from all regions. Unfortunately, Gaukuni wasn't given any position in the new government of the National Union. Gaukuni resumed fighting by launching an offensive war in the north of Chad until March 1979, when a new government was reached in Cairo, Nigeria under Unor, and made Gaukuni chairman of the new Council of State. Tom Balbit's failure to create a national army. Effect of the civil war in Chad. The civil war in Chad exposed the weakness of the OAU, for instance. The OAU peacekeeping missions in Chad did not know its real mandate was. It was divided between two backup Gaukuni's government against the rebel, or whether to keep the two rival forces apart. Its peacekeeping forces were also few and inadequately supplied. OAU members also failed to raise enough money to end the Chad Civil War because the operation in Chad was costed at £87 million in a year, but in 2 months of the force's deployment in Chad, only £270,000 had been raised so far, and it was of adequate financial support that dictated the early withdrawal of the Nigerian forces in May 1982. The war also worsened the refugee crisis in Africa. As the war dragged on, survival in Chad became tricky and uncertain. This forced many people out of the country, especially to neighboring countries like Nigeria, for instance. Sultan African history Seccesionist struggles in Africa. Soldiers or civilians stood even higher, and property destroyed was colossal grade. The war introduced militarism into the politics of Chad. The policy of the army steering the politics of Chad brought back the April 1975 coup which overthrew Tom Balbit, and he was replaced by the Major General Felix Mallam, who was in turn overthrown by Gaukumi Ade, who was in turn overthrown by Hissène Habré on the 11th June 1982. The civil war in Chad also paralyzed the economic life there. As fighting intensified, economic activities like agriculture and industrial production broke down. Places like Bardai, Taibsti, and other towns became zones of cross-fire fighting. In the process, property was destroyed like roads, buildings, and general economic life disrupted. This caused economic decline in Chad. The civil war also alienated and divided the people of Chad. The more the Sere themselves were alienated by Tom Balbit's Chaditude policy and religious persecution. Tom Balbit also divided the northerners by appointing a number of Muslims to cabinet positions. This worsened the internal divisions within Chad. The civil war in Chad also manifested and intensified the Cold War conflict between USA and the Soviet Union USSR. This revealed itself through the dumping of weapons and armor from both sides. For instance, USA gave Chinook helicopters were brought, and Libya also flew in 5,000 troops in December 1980 with multiple rocket launches and heavy mortars, and 200 T from Soviet Union. The war also resulted into divisions among African countries. This division was between those African countries which opposed it. For instance, Libya supported Frolinet, and this worsened the relationship Libya and Tom Balbit's government. Gaukuni's government also hated the policy of support to Habré FAN by the Sudan and Egypt. Other countries in Africa, however, remained opposed to the civil war in Chad, for instance Kenya. The civil war in Chad also led to the disruption of social life in Chad. For instance, family life and stability became increasingly uncertain as the number of men going for war kept on increasing. This gave birth to women-headed families, as some men got killed during the war. Orphans and widows became common in Chad, hence disorganizing the whole social fabric there. Positively, the civil war in Chad led to the formation of a government of national union in 1979 with Malum as president and Habré as prime minister, and attempts were made to appoint ministers from all regions of Chad. Reference question 1. To what extent was Francois Tom Balbit responsible for the outbreak of the civil wars in Chad?